He bid 19 cents for a 48-year-old widow, refused 26 times. She owned a secret deed. The gavel was already coming down. I remember the sound of it, that particular crack of green wood on a pine board that the Holt County auctioneer used, a man named Purvis Dole who smelled like tobacco and bad decisions, and who I had never once seen blink. The gavel came down, and the crowd made that particular sound crowds make when something shameful has just been made official. Not loud, not a gasp, just a low, settling exhale, the way air goes out of a barn after something dies in it. She was standing at the east edge of the auction yard, off to herself, which was telling. A woman with friends stands among them. She had none. She was wearing a dark wool dress that had been mended twice at the left shoulder and once along the hem, and she was holding a small leather satchel against her side, the way you hold something when you know someone nearby wants to take it from you. She wasn't crying. I noticed that first. 26 refusals, and she wasn't crying. She was looking at a point somewhere between the auctioneer's stand and the middle distance. That particular look a person gets when they're doing arithmetic in their head that keeps coming out wrong. Her name was Cecile Ford, widow of Martin Ford, who died 14 months prior of a chest ailment that took him slowly and unkindly, the way some ailments do. Martin had been a decent man by most accounts, middling with money, better with horses than with ledgers, and he had left Cecile with a small house on the north edge of Caldwell Flats, a kitchen garden, one aging draft horse, and a debt to Harlan Speck's bank that nobody in the county had seen the actual number on, but everybody had theories about. I knew Martin slightly. We had shared a fence line for 11 years. We'd helped each other with the big work, roundups, fence repairs after the hard winters, and I'd been to his table twice for supper, once when my own chimney was being rebuilt and I'd have starved otherwise, and once after my wife passed, when Martin and Cecile had come to my door with a pot of something hot and had the decency not to stay long. That's the kind of people they were. I was standing at the back of the auction yard the way I usually stood at things in those years, which is to say behind most of the crowd and near an exit. I was 63 years old. I had been working the same piece of land in Holt County for 31 years, and before that I'd worked other men's land for 12 years after the war, drifting north and then west, following water and work, the way a man does when he's got nothing to go back to and nowhere particular to be. My name is Callum Reese. I have never been the kind of man who gets pointed out in a crowd, and I preferred it that way. The auction was a foreclosure sale. Harlan Speck's bank had called the note on Cecile Ford's property, and Harlan Speck, who was a careful and particular man in his cruelties, had arranged for it to be sold at the first Monday auction in October, when the weather had turned gray and the farmers who might bid were flush from harvest and present in numbers. He wanted an audience for it. I don't know that I can prove that, but I know it. I'd watched Harlan Speck operate for 20 years. The property up for bid was the house, the lot it stood on, and the attached outbuilding, which was a small stable. The kitchen garden was not listed separately. The draft horse had already been taken, I was told, against another debt, smaller, owed to the feed store. 26 men had been approached in the preceding weeks about placing a bid. I heard this from Nate Colley, who ran the dry goods and who heard most things before they became fact. 26 men, some of them had hemmed, some had looked interested and then looked away. Some had been outright cold about it. The reasons varied. The debt was uncertain. The property was small. The house needed its roof seen to. And there was Cecile herself, 48 years old, plain-spoken, not a woman who angled or softened herself to make a man feel easy. Some men are put off by that. Most of them, in my experience. They want a woman grateful and diminished, and they call it kindness. Cecile Ford had never been grateful for things that didn't earn it. The starting bid had been set at $12 by the bank's representative, a young man named Elias Tuck who wore a suit that didn't fit him and who sweated even in cold weather. Nobody bid. Elias Tuck dropped it to $8. Still nothing. There was a moment, I can't explain it clearly. I have tried afterward and I can't. It wasn't pity. I want to be plain about that because I've had men assume it was pity and I've had to correct them, sometimes more firmly than was comfortable for everyone involved. It wasn't sentiment either. I'm not a sentimental man by nature. My wife had been gone 6 years and I'd been alone 6 years and I'd learned to be something like sufficient. I had my land, my cattle, my work, my own cooking which was adequate if not interesting. I had learned to sleep in the middle of the bed. But there is a thing that happens sometimes, a thing I don't have a proper name for, where you look at a situation and you see its shape so clearly it's almost like looking at a piece of country from high ground. You see what's coming. You see how the ground lays and where the water runs and what kind of winter this particular draw is going to have. And what I saw, standing at the back of that auction yard watching Elias tuck sweat in his wrong-sized suit, while Cecil Ford stood alone holding her leather satchel, was a shape I recognized. A shape I knew, from my own life and from other lives I'd watched, that it would be very hard to come back from once it settled in full. She'd lose the house, she'd have nowhere to go. She had a sister in Missouri, Nate Colley had mentioned. I had filed that away without meaning to, but a sister in Missouri is a long way from anything a woman has built of her own. And Cecil Ford was the kind of woman who built things and had things of her own. You could see that in how she stood, even now. I looked at what I had. I had my land. I had a little money, not a lot, not the kind that invites risk, but enough. I had a spare room in my house that had been a spare room for 6 years and showed no signs of becoming anything else. I bid $8. The crowd turned to look at me. Elias Tuck looked at me. Purvis Dole looked at me and didn't blink, which was his usual state. Then Harlan Speck, who was standing to the left of the auctioneer's stand with his hands folded at the small of his back, looked at me. He was a tall man, Speck, with a narrow face and careful, still eyes. He looked at me the way a man looks at an unexpected development, not angry yet, just noting, calibrating. Purvis Dole said, "I have $8, and he said it with very little enthusiasm. He said, "Do I have 9? The crowd was quiet. Now here is where the 19 cents comes in, and I know it has become something of a story in Caldwell Flats, and I know it has grown in the telling over the years, and some of what people say about it is true and some isn't. And I'm going to tell you exactly what happened." Purvis Dole was about to call the bid for $8. He had the gavel up. I could see Cecil Ford's jaw tighten from 40 feet away. And then a boy, one of the Greeley boys, the youngest, maybe 7 years old, who had apparently been playing in the dirt behind the bidders, held up a tin coin and yelled that he wanted to bid too. It was not a real bid. He had a tin coin, a toy, a nothing. The crowd laughed. Some of the laughter was kind and some wasn't. And I said, and I can hear my own voice saying it in that flat, carrying way I apparently have that my wife used to say was like a fence post stating its own height. I said, "I bid $8.19. I don't know why 19. I had some coins in my left pocket, a mix of small things, and I pulled out whatever my hand found, and 19 is what it came to. The boy's toy bid was a cent, if you were being generous about it, and I was minded to be generous. It seemed right to include him. There was a long pause. Purvis Dole said, "I have $8.19. Do I have 8.20? Silence. The gavel came down. What happened next is a thing I've gone over many times in the years since. The way you go over a piece of ground you've ridden across in the dark, trying to account for every step. What happened was that Harlan Speck walked over to me before I had fully turned from the auctioneer's stand, and he said, in a voice meant to be quiet but which was not quite quiet enough, that $8.19 didn't touch the debt on that property, and that I was buying a problem. I told him I'd bought problems before and managed. He looked at me with those careful eyes, and he said that the deed would reflect the encumbrance, and I said that I understood what a deed was. He walked away. Elias Tuck came and had me sign a document that he folded and put in a leather pouch that was too large for it. I gave him the $8 in bills and the 19 cents from my pocket, which left me with a dime and 3 pennies, and I remember thinking it was a good thing I'd eaten breakfast. I went to Cecil Ford. She was standing where she'd been standing, still holding the satchel. I had a notion coming toward her that she might be angry. Some people are angry at their rescues. I have some sympathy for that. There is a particular humiliation in needing someone to step in, and the anger is sometimes at the thing that happened more than at the person who helped. But it comes out at the person because they're standing there. But she wasn't angry. She was looking at me steadily. She had gray eyes, the kind of gray that could be blue or green depending on what the light was doing. Her hair was dark going silver at the temples, and she had the kind of face that had been good-looking when younger and had come through middle age as something better than that, more particular, more itself. She said, "Mr. Reese, I know who you are." I said I knew she did. We'd been neighbors, and she said, "Yes, but that isn't what I mean." She stopped there. I didn't know what she meant. I wasn't certain she was going to tell me. I asked if she'd come by my place, that I had some things to discuss about the property, and she said she'd be there the next morning if that suited. I said it suited. I drove home thinking about the problem I had just bought. The problem had layers. The first layer was the debt, which Elia's Tuck's paperwork put at $112 and some change over and above the auction price, owed to Speck's Bank, which was now theoretically my debt as part of the property's encumbrance. That was a significant problem. Not a ruinous one, not for a man who'd been managing his land carefully for 31 years, but significant. The second layer was the house itself, which I would own but which Cecile Ford had been living in, and which raised a question about what exactly she did now, which was a question I didn't have a clear answer to and which I thought about on the drive home and didn't settle. The third layer was Harlan Speck, whose look at the auction yard I hadn't liked and hadn't forgotten. A man like Speck, who arranges his cruelties carefully, doesn't enjoy having them interrupted by an $8 bid from a man he doesn't own. I thought about all three layers on the drive home, in between thinking about whether I'd left the damper open on the stove, which I had. Cecile arrived the next morning at 7:30, which told me something about her. She was driving herself in a small wagon. I found out later she'd borrowed it from the Greeley family who had the farm adjacent to hers, and she had the leather satchel with her. She was wearing a different dress, heavier wool, better for the cold. She tied the horse at my rail with a particular knot I noticed because it was a good knot, a hauling knot, practical, not the decorative looping some people do when they're not actually thinking about the horse. I had coffee on. I poured 2 cups and we sat at my kitchen table, which was a wide table pine that my wife and I had bought from a furniture maker in Abilene, and which had traveled in a wagon for 40 miles and hadn't been entirely the same since, one leg repaired twice. Cecile put her hands around the cup and didn't drink immediately, just held the heat of it, and I understood that without needing it explained. She said, "I owe you thanks, Mr. Reese." I told her I'd bought a property, and I was glad the price was fair to both of us, which was a way of making it not about the thanks without dismissing it entirely. She looked at me with those gray eyes, and she seemed to be deciding something. She put the satchel on the table. She said, "You need to know something about what you bought." I said I was listening. She opened the satchel and took out a folded document. It was old paper, the kind that gets brittle at the folds, and it had been handled enough that the folds were soft and well known. She unfolded it carefully and set it flat on the table between us, turning it so I could read it. It was a land deed. Not for the house, not for the lot. It was for 160 acres of grazing land in the upper Cimarron Valley, deeded to a James Orrin Beckett, dated 1861, transferred by hand notation to Martin Ford in 1879, signed by both parties and witnessed by a man named Aldous Price, who I happen to know had been a justice of the peace in Comanche County until he died in 1882. I read it twice. She was watching me. I said, "Does Speck know about this?" She said no. I said, "How?" She said that Martin had kept it separate, that it was from before their marriage, that Martin had gotten it from his uncle in exchange for work and had never registered it with Holt County because the land was in the next county over and Martin had always meant to get to it and hadn't. She said Speck had called the note on everything Martin had registered. This wasn't registered. It hadn't been included in the accounting of the estate. She had held it back. I sat with that for a minute. I said, "You held it back and let them take the house." She said yes. I said, "Why?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because Harlan Speck would have taken the land too and found a way to do it legally, and I would have been left with nothing. The house was always going to go." She'd known it from 3 weeks after Martin died, and she'd looked at the numbers. The house was the sacrifice. The land was the thing worth saving. I looked at the deed again. 160 acres in the upper Cimarron Valley. That was good land. That was valuable land, depending on the water, and if I recalled correctly, and I thought I did, because I'd looked at land in that area years before, there was a spring creek on the north end of that valley that made it worth considerably more than its size. I said, "So what are you asking me?" She said she wasn't asking anything. She was telling me what I'd bought, because I'd bought it fair and I deserved to know what I was holding. I said I bought a house on a lot with a debt, and that was the auction item. She said yes. I said this deed wasn't in the auction. She said no, it wasn't. I said, so this is yours. She looked at me levelly and said, technically, Mr. Reese, it's very complicated. The bank might argue the land was an undisclosed asset in Martin's estate. She said she'd had Nate Colley's brother-in-law, who was a lawyer of middling quality, look at it, and his view was that because the land had never been registered in Holt County and wasn't included in the estate filing, her legal exposure was, and she used his word, ambiguous. I thought about that word, ambiguous. It was not a word I would have chosen to stake my security on. She said she had a proposition. I waited. She said she would sign half the deed over to me, registered properly in both counties, in exchange for the debt relief on the house property and a right to remain on the house lot for 2 years, at which point she would use her half share of the land either to sell and get clear or to negotiate from a position that wasn't desperation. She said it plainly, without apology, without embellishment. She had clearly been forming this proposition for some time, possibly for weeks. Possibly since before the auction, which meant she had calculated on someone buying the house, had perhaps even considered who might buy it and what they might accept. I thought about that. I didn't decide how I felt about it. I said, you came to this auction expecting to make a deal. She said she came to the auction expecting to lose her house and hoping to preserve enough to rebuild. And she had her proposition ready because her alternative was going to Missouri with nothing. And she had spent 14 months looking at that alternative, and she had not been able to make herself accept it. I sat there for a while. The stove was ticking. The coffee was getting cool. I said, let me look at the deed for another minute. She let me look. The land was there. The water was there. The deed appeared sound as I could read a deed which was adequate without being expert. The Aldous Price signature was genuine. I thought I'd seen his signature before on county documents, the particular loop of the P. I said you'd take half. She said half was fair for the risk she was asking me to take. I said the risk to her in the alternative was total loss. She said yes. I said I'm not taking half. She went still. I said I'll clear the debt, and I was already calculating, already knowing I'd have to pull from the account I kept at the Merchants Trust in Wichita, the one I'd been building for 11 years against the day I might want to expand. I'll clear the debt, and you keep the deed entire. I'll take a promissory note from you for $50, 12 months, no interest, against your share of whatever the land earns you in that time. If the land earns nothing in 12 months, we'll renegotiate. If it earns something, you pay the 50 when you can. If things go badly wrong for you, we'll work it out. She looked at me for a long time, not the calculating look, a different look, the kind of look that takes you apart a little at a time. She said, why? I said because 160 acres of good Cimarron land was worth a great deal more than $50 plus the debt, and I wasn't willing to take half of something worth that much from a woman who'd spent a year protecting it. I said it wouldn't sit right with me. She said, it's a sound business arrangement on my side, Mr. Reese. You don't have to make it a favor. I said I wasn't. I said I was making it a sensible transaction that wouldn't keep me up nights, which was a different thing entirely. She was quiet again. Then she said, all right. She said she'd have Colley's brother-in-law draw up the note. She said she'd like to stay through winter if I still had no objection to her in the house. She'd pay something toward the lot. She said, whatever was reasonable, a few dollars a month for wood and upkeep. I said the house was hers to winter in and I didn't want her money. She said, Mr. Reese, I'm not a charity case. I said I didn't think she was. I said I had a fence line on the north pasture that needed new posts, about 60 feet of it, and if she knew how to cut and set fence posts, she could work it off come spring. I said it with a straight face. She looked at me, then something happened to the corners of her mouth, not quite a smile. The idea of one held back. She said she'd cut fence posts. I said good. I said we had a deal. She folded the deed back into the satchel. Her hands were steady, which I noticed because mine would not have been. She stood and picked up her coffee cup and drank the last of it cold, which was another thing I noted. Not precious about comfort. I liked that. She thanked me again at the door, briefly, and I said there was nothing to thank, and she said there was, and she'd thank me whether I liked it or not. And she went out and untied the horse with that good hauling knot and drove back toward Caldwell Flats. I stood at the door a minute after she'd gone and looked at the north pasture with its sagging fence and thought about a number of things in no particular order. Then I went inside and spent 3 hours going over my accounts, because $112 plus change was not nothing, and I wanted to be precise about how I was going to move it. The problem with Harlan's spec, I thought, could wait. It didn't. He came to my place that same Thursday, 4 days after the auction. He drove a good buggy, a black one, with a horse that was better than it needed to be for the roads around Caldwell Flats. He came alone, which told me he was coming to talk and not to threaten, though with spec the difference wasn't always meaningful. I met him at the gate. He said Callum. He was always careful with names. He said, "I'll come to the point." I said that was fine. He said the auction had gone a certain way and that was done. He had no quarrel with what was done, but he said he'd heard things. He said he'd heard that Martin Ford might have had assets that hadn't been fully accounted for. He said he wasn't accusing anyone of anything. He said he was just hearing things and thought it was neighborly to mention it. I looked at him for a moment. I said I'd heard no such thing. He said no. I said no. I said Martin Ford's wife had come to me as the new title holder on the property to discuss a few practical matters, when she'd be vacating, what she was taking with her, that sort of thing, and that in the course of that conversation I'd come to understand that Martin Ford had died about as clean as a man could die. House, debt, one horse already gone. I said she was going to her sister in Missouri come spring. Spec watched me say all of that. His face was still. He said Missouri. I said Missouri. He said that was a shame, and I couldn't read whether he meant it or not. He said, well, he paused. He said he hoped I hadn't overpaid for the property. I said $8.19 had suited me fine. He almost smiled at that, not quite. There was something in his face that was maybe respect and maybe calculation, and was certainly neither warmth nor friendship. He picked up his reins. He said, Callum, you're a hard man to read. I said that was generally my preference. He drove away. I went inside and sat down and let my hands be still for a minute, because that had been a particular kind of conversation, the kind that looks like a visit and is actually an examination, and I was fairly sure I'd passed it, but I was also fairly sure it wasn't finished. I wrote Cecil Ford a letter that evening, kept it short, told her that there'd been a visit, that I'd said what I said, and that if she was asked about going to Missouri, she should not be surprised. I said she didn't need to go anywhere. I said just be ready for the question. She wrote back the next day, hand-delivered it, left it with my hired man, a young fellow named Dex Farley who worked my South Acres, and her letter was 3 sentences long. She said she understood. She said she'd answer questions as she saw fit, which was always, and I didn't need to coach her. She said thank you for the warning. I read those 3 sentences twice and then laughed, which was not something I'd done in a while. Winter came in early that year. The first hard frost was in the 3rd week of October, and by November there was real cold, the kind that finds the gaps in old buildings and settles in for the season. I had my hands full with my own herd. We'd had a dry summer and the grazing had been thin, and I was supplementing feed from the stack in my barn, which meant watching the stack go down every day and doing the arithmetic about how long it would last against how long winter might. It was the kind of arithmetic that will age a man if he does it too long every day, so I'd gotten in the habit of doing it once in the morning and then setting it aside. Cecile came by twice in November. Once to look at the deed situation. She'd had Colley's brother-in-law draw up a proper legal description of the Cimarron land, and she wanted me to look it over, and I did. And it seemed solid enough that I told her to file it in both counties, which she said she'd already done, and once just to bring bread, which she said she'd made too much of, which may have been true. The bread was good. Dense, dark, with something in it I couldn't identify that made it better than ordinary bread. I didn't ask what it was. On that second visit she stayed for supper, at my invitation, and we talked for 2 hours at the pine table with the repaired leg, and it was, I don't have a careful word for this, it was easy. The conversation was easy. She was direct and she was curious, and she had thoughts about things, opinions, formed opinions, the kind that come from actually thinking and not just repeating what you've heard. She'd read things. She had a view about the railroad coming through which was different from mine, and she made me defend my view, which I found I could only partially do, and I said so, and she nodded like that was the right answer. She left before dark. I stood at the door again after she'd gone, as I had before, but this time it was not because I was thinking about fence posts. December was hard and January harder. I lost 2 head to the cold, which hurt, not the money of it as much as the I don't know, the failure of it, the feeling that I should have done better by them. I'd moved the rest of the herd into closer pasture by then, keeping them where I could watch them, and I was out before first light most mornings checking water and feed, and doing the thousand small things that keep cattle alive in bad cold. Cecile sent Dex over one morning in January with a message that her chimney was giving trouble, not drawing right smoke backing in, and was there someone who could look at it? I went myself that afternoon. It was a straightforward problem, a partial blockage about 6 feet up, some debris from the fall, and I had it cleared inside of an hour, standing on her roof in 14-degree cold with a long iron rod that I'd brought for the purpose. She made coffee when I came down, and this time she had a piece of dried apple cake that I will say without hesitation was the best thing I had eaten since my wife died. I said so, which was perhaps more than I'd meant to say. She looked at me. She said, "Your wife was a good cook." I said she was a very good cook, among other things. She said, "You miss her?" I said yes. I said I had gotten used to missing her, which was a different thing from not missing her. She said she understood that. She said she'd been missing Martin for 14 months, and she was not yet used to it, but she thought she could see the shape of what used to it might eventually look like, and it looked different from what she'd feared. She said she'd feared it would look like just nothing, just an empty place. She said it was more like, and she paused and looked for the word, she said it was more like a room you didn't go into every day anymore. Still there, still holding what it held, you just weren't living in it. I sat with that for a minute. It was a true thing, well said. I thought about my own room I didn't go into every day, and I thought she described it better than I ever had to myself. I said yes, I said that was exactly right. She looked at her coffee cup. We sat there for another few minutes without talking, which was comfortable in the way that some silences are, the ones that don't need filling. I went home in the late afternoon, and the cold was biting and the road was hard, and I thought about what she'd said about rooms. I thought about it for a long time. February came, and with it the particular cruelty that February has in that country, not the coldest month, but the longest feeling one, the one where the cold has outlasted your patience with it, and the light is just barely beginning to come back, and you can see spring from a distance, but you cannot reach it yet. I was working more than I should have, probably, putting in hours that a younger man could absorb, and that I was absorbing because the work itself kept me from too much thought. My herd was thinner than I liked. The winter wasn't killing me, but it was reminding me that it could. It was in that first week of February that Harlan Speck made his second move. He sent 2 men to Cecile's house. I didn't know this when it was happening. I found out from Dex Farley, who had been passing by on an errand and had seen the buggy out front, the Speck Banks buggy, black with a yellow wheel, which everyone in the county knew, and had thought to mention it to me when he got back. He mentioned it the way a man mentions something he thinks might be more important than it seems. I went to Cecile's house the next morning. She was fine. That was the first thing I saw when she opened the door. She was fine, straight-backed, jaw set, eyes clear. But there was a tightness around her mouth that had not been there before. I asked what they'd wanted. She said they'd come with a document. A claim that certain personal property of Martin Ford's estate had not been properly accounted for, that there may have been irregularities in the estate filing, and that the bank reserved the right to pursue a full accounting. She said the man who'd done the talking, not Elias Tuck, a different man, older in a good coat, had mentioned that holding back assets from a creditor during foreclosure proceedings could be considered fraudulent conveyance, depending on how a judge looked at it. I sat down. She sat across from me and put the document on the table. It was 3 pages, official-looking, with the bank's seal on the first page. I read it. It was carefully written. It didn't name the Cimarron land specifically. It didn't name anything specifically. It was a general preservation of rights, a legal throat-clearing, the kind of thing a careful lawyer writes when his client knows something but can't prove it yet and wants to keep the door open. What it meant was, Speck suspected the deed. He didn't have proof. He was serving notice that he was going to look. She said, "He's guessing." I said yes. She said, "But he's going to keep guessing until he finds something." I said yes. She was quiet. Then she said, "The filing in both counties, the deed I filed, it's in my name. He'll find it eventually when he searches the records." I said he would. She looked at me. She said, "I'm sorry." She said she hadn't meant to bring this onto me. I said she hadn't brought anything onto me, that I'd walked into this with my eyes open, and that there was no sense in apology. She said, "What do we do?" And here is where I will tell you something about the feeling that came up in me in that moment, because it's important and I want to be precise about it. It was not the feeling of a man who's been put in a bad spot. It was the opposite of that. It was the feeling of a man who has something to do, something specific and real, a problem that can be solved with the right kind of work, and who has the capability to do it. After 6 years of being alone and sufficient and not required for anything beyond my own land and my own cattle, there was something in me that recognized this, the shape of being needed, the particular fit of it, and it was not a burden. It was the reverse of a burden. It was a purpose. I said, "We do this right." I said I was going to Wichita. I said I was going to find a lawyer, a better one than Colley's brother-in-law, with respect to Colley's brother-in-law. And I was going to have the deed situation reviewed and documented properly. And I was going to understand precisely what Speck could and couldn't do. And then I was going to have a conversation with Harlan Speck himself, in his own bank, with whatever I needed to have the conversation properly. She said, "That will take money." I said I had money. She said, "Callum," and she used my name the first time she had, and there was something in the way she said it, just a weight to it, just the sound of it in her voice, that I felt in my chest. She said, "Callum, you've already done more than." I said, "I know what I've done, and I know what I'm doing, and I'd like to go ahead and do it, if you don't have an objection." She stopped. Then she said, "I don't have an objection." I went to Wichita the following week. I was there for 3 days. The lawyer I found was a man named Gideon Harp, recommended by a man I'd done cattle business with for years, who described Harp as hard-nosed and exact and not easily impressed by bank papers. Harp turned out to be all 3 of those things. He was about my age, bald, with the kind of steady hands that surgeons and lawyers of the better kind seem to have. He read the deed. He read Speck's document. He asked me 6 questions, each one precise and cutting. He thought for a while. He said the deed transfer was valid, it predated the Ford marriage, predated the debt, and had been properly executed and witnessed, even if the registration had been delayed. The delay was irregular but not fraudulent. The fraudulent conveyance argument, he said, would not survive a serious legal examination. Speck was bluffing with a hand that would fold at the table. He said I should carry a letter from him addressed to Speck's bank, stating these conclusions clearly and offering to receive any contrary legal opinions Speck wished to present. He said, in his experience, a bank that was bluffing usually stopped bluffing when it received such a letter, because bluffing was for situations without witnesses, and this letter would create a witness. I paid him $55, which was a proper fee for 3 days of a good lawyer's attention, and I drove back to Caldwell Flats with the letter in my breast pocket. I gave Cecil a copy of the letter, and I kept the original. I went to Speck's bank on a Thursday morning, which was a day I'd chosen because I knew Speck was usually in the building on Thursdays, and I asked to see Harlan Speck, and after about 10 minutes I was shown into his office. It was a well-appointed office. He had a good desk, better than mine, and a portrait of something on the wall that I didn't look at closely. He stood when I came in, which was a courtesy he didn't have to extend but did, and I thought, as I had thought before, that Harlan Speck was a particular kind of difficult man, not crude, not ignorant, not driven by simple greed. A man who was intelligent and careful, and had decided at some point that the world was a set of levers, and his job was to know which ones to pull. That kind of man is harder to deal with than a crude one, and also, in my experience, more straightforward once you put your cards on the table properly. I put Harp's letter on his desk. He read it, he took his time, he set it down. He said, "Gideon Harp." I said, "Yes." He said, "I've had dealings with Harp before." I said I expected he had. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the letter again. He said, "You've been thorough." I said I tried to be. He said, and I'll give him credit here, because a smaller man would have pressed on, he said, well. He said it appeared the Ford estate situation was cleaner than he'd had reason to think. He said he'd have his people look at the filing, and if everything was as represented in Harp's letter, he didn't see a need for further action. I said that was my hope. He said, and Mrs. Ford is going to Missouri. I said I believed her plans were her own business. He looked at me with those careful, still eyes. He said, "Callum," he said, "I'll be direct." He said he didn't like being maneuvered, and that whatever arrangement I had with the Ford woman was my own business. But he wanted me to know he was aware there was an arrangement, and he was aware of its general nature, and while he wasn't going to pursue it legally, he was going to remember it. I said he was welcome to remember whatever he liked. I stood up, I put my hat on. I said good morning, I walked out. I'm going to tell you something about walking out of Harlan Speck's bank that morning. I have lived 63 years, and some of them were very hard, and some of them were good, and a few of them were something better than good. I had built a ranch out of poor land and difficult weather. I had buried my wife. I had learned to be alone. I was not a man who needed recognition from anyone to understand his own worth. But there is a specific satisfaction in a specific kind of thing, in having a problem in front of you and having the capacity to meet it and meeting it and walking out the other side of it on your feet. And that satisfaction is its own thing, separate from pride, separate from what anyone else sees or acknowledges. You know it in your body. In the set of your shoulders on a particular cold February morning, coming out through a bank door into a street where your horse is standing at the rail exactly as you left him, and the sky is a particular shade of pale gray, and the air is cold enough to be real. I stood at the rail for a moment. I drove to Nate Colley's Dry Goods and bought a tin of coffee because I was nearly out, and a sack of dried beans, and on impulse a small thing, a bar of soap that was wrapped in paper and smelled of something I didn't know the name of, some herb or flower. I can't tell you exactly why I bought that last item. I gave it to Cecil the following week, and she looked at it and looked at me and said thank you plainly without embellishment and put it on the shelf above the kitchen basin. March came and the ground started to soften, and I had the particular kind of busyness that comes with the beginning of the working year, when there's everything to do at once, and the weather is still unpredictable, and your plans change twice a day. But Cecil was on my mind. Not anxiously, not with any urgency, just present, the way a thing is present when it belongs there. She came to help with the fence in the 3rd week of March, as she'd said she would. I will admit I had not expected her to actually do it. I thought she might send a few dollars instead, which would have been reasonable, and I would have accepted it without comment. But she arrived on the first clear morning of the 3rd week with her own tools, a post-hole digger, and a heavy mallet that looked like it had belonged to Martin Ford and had been used hard. And she worked for 3 days straight alongside me and Dex Farley, cutting and setting 60 feet of post. And she worked with the steady, unshowy competence of someone who had done it before and didn't require praise for it. On the 2nd day, we worked side by side for most of the afternoon. The ground was still half frozen in the shade and easier where the sun had been, and we'd developed a rhythm. I'd work the post-hole digger and she'd clear the loose dirt and set the post and hold it while I tamped. And there was a quality to that rhythm, the two of us moving around each other in a small space without discussion, that I thought about afterward. When two people can work together like that, without wasted motion and without commentary, it's not nothing. It's something it takes a long time to build with a person, usually. On the 3rd day, near the end of the afternoon, she hit a rock about 2 feet down on the last post hole, and the digger glanced, and she put a cut across the heel of her left hand. Not deep but sharp, and it bled for a minute. I had a rag in my pocket, a clean enough one, and I wrapped it around her hand and held it there. She let me. She looked down at my hands holding hers, and she didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Callum, you have been extraordinarily kind to me." I said I'd done what seemed right. She said, "I know." She said, "That's what I mean." She looked up at me then. It was late afternoon, the light long and low, and there was something in her face that I recognized, not from her, from the situation itself. The particular moment when something that has been a question in the air between two people becomes not quite a question anymore, when both people can see the shape of the answer at the same time, and neither one has said it yet. I said, "Cecil," I said, "when you're done paying off the promissory note." She waited. I said, "I'd like to ask you something, a different kind of question." She looked at me, those gray eyes gray going blue in the late light. She said, "I think I can guess the question." I said, "Can you?" She said, "Yes." I said, "What's your answer?" She said, "Ask me the question first, Callum. Do it right." I held her wrapped hand a moment longer. The last post was still unlevel in its hole, waiting to be tamped. Dex Farley had gone in for water and had the good sense not to come back. I asked her the question. She stood there in the cold March light with her cut hand in my hands, and she said yes. She said it once, plainly, looking straight at me, and that was enough. "We finished the fence." She went back to the house and I went back to mine, and I sat with it for a while, that feeling. It was not the flushed, unsteady feeling of a young man. I was 63 years old. I had been married once happily for 20 years, and I had been alone for 6. What I felt was quieter than what young men feel, but it went deeper. It was the feeling of something that had been held out of place returning to where it belonged. A joint setting. A timber seeding into a mortise it was cut for. I want to be fair to the story here and tell you that not everything after that was easy, because nothing ever is, not in full. Spring was hard work, summer harder. The Cimarron land situation resolved itself carefully over the following months. Cecil had a buyer's interest come August, a rancher from the next county who wanted to expand his grazing, and we sat with Gideon Harp over those negotiations and came out of them with a sum that was more than fair. More than enough for Cecil to put herself in a position that had nothing to do with anyone's charity or anyone's pressure. She paid me the $50 on the note in July, 4 months early, and she did it without ceremony, in cash, laid on the pine table on a hot afternoon, and I took it without comment, which was the right thing for both of us. She moved into my house in September, after we'd been married in Caldwell Flats by the Presbyterian minister, who was a small, careful man who performed weddings with the same precision he brought to everything else, which was considerable. Nate Colley was there. Dex Farley was there. Gideon Harp sent a letter because he couldn't make the trip from Wichita but wanted to be acknowledged. The Greeley family sent their youngest boy, the one who'd held up the tin coin at the auction, with a jar of preserves and a note from his mother that said she was glad things had worked out. I thought about that tin coin sometimes. A child's bid, a cent that wasn't a cent, and the moment it had clarified for me, or maybe released in me, I'm not sure what I was going to do. Harlan Speck never pursued the matter further. I saw him twice more in the following year, once on the street in Caldwell Flats and once at a meeting of the County Cattlemen's Association, and both times he gave me the same look. Careful, still, the look of a man who has noted something in his ledger and will not forget it, but has also concluded that the calculation doesn't favor further action. It was, in its way, a form of respect, the kind that comes from being outmaneuvered cleanly. I could accept that. Cecil was good with the house. As she had been with the house she'd lost, unsentimental about it, practical, not decorating but maintaining, keeping it the way a working place should be kept. She put curtains on the south windows, that first fall, dark red ones that she'd had from before, and they changed the quality of the afternoon light in a way that made the room feel different. Warmer, but not softer, more inhabited. We had our disagreements, as two people who have both been alone and self-determining will always have disagreements. She had opinions and I had opinions, and we were both past the age of backing down from them without reason. There were 3 or 4 arguments in that first year that were actual arguments, raised voices, the kind you feel in your neck the next morning, and each one ended with both of us having said what was true and having heard what the other said, and having adjusted, which is not the same as giving up. We were both too old and too stubborn for the easy kinds of peace. But I want to tell you about a specific night in that first winter together, the second winter I'd known her. January again, the hard month. We'd had 2 days of weather that kept us inside, which is the real test of two people, whether they can share a closed space without either of them going strange. We'd managed it. We'd cooked together, the two of us in the kitchen, which was a new arrangement that required some negotiation about who controlled which part of the stove and for how long. We'd eaten at the pine table. We'd read in the evening, she with a book, me with the week's newspaper. The lamp between us put a circle of light on the table, and she was within it and I was within it, and the weather was outside and we were not. At some point she looked up from her book. She looked at me for a moment without saying anything. Then she said, "Callum," she said, "I want to tell you something." I put down the newspaper. She said, "I want to tell you that I have felt in the past year more," and she paused, looking for the word "more like myself," she said, "than I have in a long time." She said she didn't mean against Martin, not in comparison. She meant something different. She meant that she had been, for a while, only what had happened to her. The debt, the foreclosure, the auction, the humiliation of 26 refusals, and a house sold for $8. She had been the accumulation of those things. And she said that I had. She said this plainly, without excessive sentiment, the way she said things. She said that I had made it possible for her to be something other than that again. That I had taken the situation seriously and done what was needed and not made her smaller in the doing of it. She looked at me steadily. She said, "You're a good man, Callum Reese. I don't say it because I'm supposed to, and I don't say it lightly. I say it because it's true, and I've been watching you long enough to know. There are not clean words for what that felt like. I was 63 years old, going on 64. I had worked hard and alone for a long time, and I had not been seen, not particularly, not since my wife died, not in a way that had any weight to it. I was adequate. I was reliable. I was the man who did the work. Nobody wrote poems about the man who did the work. Nobody said much about him at all. I sat with what she'd said for a moment. Then I got up from the table and I went around to her side and I put my hand on the side of her face and she leaned into it, just slightly, just the weight of a cheek against a palm, and I stood there in the lamp circle for a moment and the storm was outside and she was warm and real and looking up at me with those gray eyes, and I thought, this is the thing. This specific thing right here. This is what it is. I don't have anything to add to that. I don't think it needs anything added. There is one more thing I want to tell you, and then I'm done. The following spring in April, we drove up to the Cimarron Valley together. The sale had gone through in the fall, but she'd wanted to go back once, just once, to see the land herself, the land Martin's uncle had deeded him, and that she'd protected through the worst year of her life. I said I'd go with her. It was a long drive, a day and a half. We camped one night on the road, nothing fancy, a fire and bedrolls and the good cold air of an April night in that country. She'd brought the dark bread and I'd brought coffee and some salt pork and we ate and talked, and she told me more about Martin than she had before, in the easy way you talk about the past when you're somewhere new, when there's no structure around the conversation. I told her about my own early years, the ones after the war, the drifting, the slow accumulation of purpose. I'd never told those years to anyone fully. She listened without interrupting, and she asked one question at the end that was so exact that it made me look at her. The land itself was everything I'd thought and more. Good grass coming up strong, the creek on the north end exactly where I'd remembered it being, running clear and cold with snowmelt. She walked up to the creek and stood at the edge of it for a while, and I let her stand there and didn't say anything. The mountains were up to the west, still carrying snow. The sky above them was the particular deep blue of high country in April. She came back to where I was standing. She took my hand, which she didn't do often. She was not, as I said, demonstrative in the usual ways, and she held it without looking at me, looking at the water. She said Martin never saw it. I said I knew. She said, I'm glad someone does. We stood there for a while, her hand in mine, the cold water, the sound of it over the rocks, the sky. Then she said, all right, let's go. And she said it like herself, plainly, and let go of my hand and walked back to the wagon, and I followed her. That was 8 years ago. We still have the ranch. We still have the pine table with the repaired leg. She still makes the dark bread. The curtains are still on the south windows, and the afternoon light is still warm without being soft. And I am still, at 71 years old, a man who gets up before first light and does the work and doesn't require much said about it. But I have, beside me, a woman who sees it, who has always seen it, who chose to see it freely and keeps choosing. That's the whole thing, I think. That's the whole account. A 19-cent bid, a secret deed, and a woman who knew what she was worth and eventually told me what I was worth too. That's enough, that's everything.